reason why so much science fiction is infantile is because the characters are not complex. They can't afford to be complex, so it's perfectly fair to make them adolescents. But as you become interested in character, in individuals, in creating individuals and putting them in specific situations, you gradually lose the science fiction elements.
Michael Moorcock's career began when he sold a short story at 15. Today, he's a prolific and popular writer with novels ranging from the weird and fantastic trilogy, Dances at the End of Time, to classic sword and sorcery in the haunted world of the warrior King Elric and his magical sword Stormbringer. Moorcock's fantasy worlds inspire an industry of posters and calendars and comic strips adapted from his stories. But there's another side to Moorcock, as fellow writer Thomas M. Dish explains.
I think the most amazing thing about Mike is the way he pursued two careers simultaneously. He supported himself as an incredibly prolific hack writer, writing mostly sword and sorcery novels of a sort that I just can't read that genre at all. While he was doing that, at the same time, he became an artist.
It was the emergence of Moorcock as a serious artist which inspired the young writers dubbed the New Wave. Frederick Pohl.
Difficulty with the New Wave was that they were so arrogant about being the only true word in the revealed doctrine. They said that no other kind of science fiction should be written, saying things like nobody should write stories about spaceships going to Venus anymore. But what's happened since then, this is 10 or 12, 15 years ago, is that there's been a fusion of the new wave and the old dinosaurs like me. The books that I'm writing now, I don't think I could have written without the influence of the new wave, and I'm grateful to them for that.
In 1964, Moorcock became editor of New Worlds, then a conventional and ailing British SF magazine, and he transformed it. The term New Wave described a group of young writers who found, during his editorship, an outlet for more experimental fiction. One of them was Brian Aldiss.
What Moorcock did was to bring in a new lot of people who felt differently and who were, above all, I think, interested in the present and in what was happening in England in the 60s. And for those of us who have memories that long, it was a more exciting time, let me say, than the 70s. And New Worlds bubbled with a ferment that was going on, not just in the universe or in the West, but in Ladbroke Grove. And it was a genuine a purging of the stables. That was really how British science fiction came to stand on its own legs.
When he's not writing in London, Moorcock comes to Ingleton in Yorkshire, where he shares a house with Mike Harrison, another of the young writers to emerge from New Worlds.
The previous editor, Ted Carnell of New Worlds, recommended me as the editor. And I had some thought about it and then thought that it was worth doing if I could encourage, not necessarily new writers, but any writers to expand more and produce work that was more individualistic, less genre-orientated, using new forms. There were writers such as Ballard who were writing a much more intense kind of fiction that was closer to some of the intentions of poetry than other science fiction. It was more concentrated. It used imagery in a much more concentrated way.
Her ungainly transit across the passenger seat through the near side door. The overlay of her knees and the metal door flank. The conjunction of the aluminized gutter trim with the volumes of her thighs. The crushing of her left breast by the door frame and its self-extension as she continued to rise. The movement of her left hand across the chromium trim of the right headlamp assembly. Her movements distorted in the projecting carapace of the bonnet. The jut and rake of her pubis as she sat in the driver's seat. The soft pressure of her thighs against the rim of the steering wheel.
being greeted by the science fiction establishment, if you like, the editors and a great many of the critics and a lot of the other writers, as something absolutely astonishingly new, dangerous, destructive, and so on. And you can't believe it. It's because you come into it not as a genre writer, not as a pulp reader, but as somebody who's read Mandelstam and T.S. Eliot and James Joyce, all the normal people that you just read. They haven't read them. They regard them as pseudo-intellectuals. I mean, that whole thing, it's a Philistine. The conventional science fiction world had become, by the time we were in it, a Philistine medium as far as it mattered. We didn't know that either.
One of the things about new wave fiction in general, to use the term, is that it has a concept of irony. There's no irony in ordinary science fiction. There's no irony in conventional science fiction. They don't understand a joke.
Oops. It's all a bit do-it-yourself, isn't it lovely?
We are not interested in refined aesthetics, but in creative science and technological know-how. Do you know what that is?
Well, it's got to be a brainwashing machine.
I've told you we've got the best brains in Europe working for us, Mr. Cornelius.
As innocents, we came into the thing. We thought, this is great stuff. Then we found, A, that the magazines were far more conservative than we imagined them to be. The editors were far more conservative than we imagined them to be. And we went to science fiction conventions, discovered that the readers and the writers were far more conservative than we imagined them to be. So we were suddenly stuck. We were, as it were, committed and turned on by the ideas, by the possibilities of the science fiction genre, by using a lot of the material as metaphor, if you like, whatever it was. And nobody would then publish us. And moreover, we were condescended to. We were told, you can't do this. I mean, we suddenly found ourselves, again, innocently, in the position of being rebels. We didn't think we were. We thought we were, joining the team, if you like. We thought, we were excited by the possibilities. But they weren't. Frederick Pohl said of me, when I started New Worlds, when it had been going a little while, he said, I spent 20 years building up these genre conventions. I'm not going to start breaking them now.
Moorcock's fascination with London is evident in many of his books. It often takes the form of a love-hate relationship. He destroys it endlessly with a whimsical sense of regret.
I played on bomb sites as a kid, and I miss the bomb sites. So in a sense, I'm putting them back in. The whole sort of romance of exploring ruined houses, which obviously you could do a great deal of in the 40s. The very strong sense, that it could be destroyed tomorrow. The other thing is that most of my characters come from London. I mean, they're based on people who are Londoners, by and large. I mean, they're not just Londoners. They're people who live in the area that I live in, the people who exist in that area, which is a very dense... I mean, I don't know whether it still is, but until recently, it was the most densely populated urban area, apart from the Gorbals. So that you've got an awful lot of people in there. And as a result, obviously, you've got a great deal of variety, because it's a heavy immigrant area of different sorts of immigrants, all kinds of immigration, both, as it were, internal and from outside of England. It's that sense of malleability, of constant change, that fascinates me about the area that I live in.
The Jerry Cornelius Quartet is probably his best-known work. Cornelius first appeared in New Worlds. Adopted by other writers, he became something of a cult figure, a hybrid, somewhere between James Bond, Mick Jagger, and a messiah. He reached Shepherd's Bush and headed up Holland Park Avenue, turning eventually into the maze that was now the Ladbroke Grove area. Through the grey dawn, through the ruins, he let the car roll straight down the obsidian length of Westbourne Grove. He had a feeling Beasley was in this area. The bishop had probably sent Karan von Krupp to find him. He reached the rubble of Ladbroke Grove, and the car could move no further. He got out and began to climb over the concrete between the fronds of twisted wire that had once reinforced it. He reached the place where the convent had stood and clambered to the highest slab to sniff the scene.
About Cornelius, it was attacking certain conventions that were going on in the media at the time, specifically on television and in things like the Sunday Times colour magazines. In one of the Cornelius books, I think the second one, he destroys various files of the Sunday Times colour magazine. There's a lot of crap being talked about science, about robots taking us over, about the computer revolution. Nobody was taking it easy. Nobody was just taking it for granted. The technology, they were treating it as if it was something fantastically new. And that technology had been around in one form or another for a very long time. All Cornelius was trying to do was to say, take it easy. It's just, it's technology, you can use it.
What about napalm? Napalm. Are you buying or selling? Asking. Who wants it? You? Give me a couple of days. Too long. Oh, shit, Jerry, come on. No, tomorrow. Tomorrow is Sunday. So, all the shops are shut.
The basic method of Cornelius was an ironic reversal. Not an attempt to parody, a successful attempt to parody a lot of the crap that was being talked in the media about science or whatever, about society. The cliches you hear all the time at every party. Jerry simply reversed them. He stood them on their heads. The ecology boom. Jerry attempted to show that we were taking it too seriously by wearing a panda skin coat. Certainly when I began to write Jerry Cornelius stories, I had a very strong sense that the method to use was an ironic reversal, and that what I was personally aiming at was a very nihilistic attempt to say, this is all ordinary, this is all very boring, okay, oil's running out, great, we're running out of copper, all the pandas are dying, it's hell, but we've got to learn to live with it. Jerry was very much a denizen of the 20th century.
Yeah, and
he exists in the catastrophe. It's going on now, and he's a part of it.
Learning to live in the late 20th century. He was learning to find human values in the. I mean, this is a fact. I mean, this is the intention. To find human values within the kind of society, the urban society specifically, that we have. I think most of us were rather sceptical of the 60s, of the mood of the 60s. Certainly most of the fiction was rather sceptical. I mean, when I did the final programme, for instance, it was a response to the mid-60s. It was more or less saying, in a Wellesian way, this is all going to end in tears. It was actually, and it was also satirising the idea that a lot of people were saying this is a new age and so on. I didn't believe it.
Professor Harrison is resting at the moment.
Well, the film, although it followed a lot of the plot of the book, actually reversed everything back into making it a series of rather fashionable statements, conventional statements. And there was a lot of conventional sexism put into the film, which didn't exist in the book.
And now it knows it all. The sum total of human knowledge.
Everything.
Okay. So it's all in there. So what's it doing?
Our problem has been to feed back that combined knowledge into a human brain and still keep it functioning normally.
But it will never work.
Tell me why.
No brain could possibly accept such an enormous charge. To blow all its circuits.
Ah.
Not one brain, Mr. Cornelius, but two. Think of it. Self-fertilizing, self-regenerating human beings. Immortal. Down through the ages.
Oh, Christ.
I told you, Jerry. I chose you for the final battle.
Oh, listen, Smiles. I'm going ahead with this, but I warn you, it's your responsibility.
Use the booster.
We must go through with this.
What's the alternative? Another year with Miss Brunner.
No, Miss Brunner. You are wrong. We shall be the new Messiah.
How are the brains standing up? Not ideal. Some sort of crossfeed we haven't accounted for.
I hope to God you haven't underestimated him.
A very tasty world.
Rock music and its myths have always intrigued Moorcock. He's recently performed and recorded with Deep Fix, but it was for his earlier association with Hawkwind that he's better known.
Somebody asked me to go along and see them, and I did go along and see them, and I liked them very much because they seemed to be rather like sort of crazed occupants of a spaceship that had been, going for at least 10,000 years. And they also took their electronics very casually. There's very little pretension. There's no references to Stockhausen, for instance. They were just a lot of crazed individuals plugging things in and seeing what came out at the other end. And I like that. I like the casual attitude to music technology. So I gradually got into writing for them and eventually performing with them. And then I did various performances of my own, occasional performances, and did an album and other stuff. And I'm still doing albums, in fact. I'd always had a fascination for wild, deserted, romantic landscape. I went to Lapland. A lot of the Cornelius stuff is set in Lapland. It's all straight. A lot of the Cornelius stuff is straight autobiographical. It's nearly all set in places I've been to. They're not imaginary places in that sense. And the romantic fascination was there, but it's also simply to get away completely clear of the environment, so that when you come back to the environment, you've sort of wiped all the tapes and you can start fresh. You can see things freshly. You can see people freshly. There's a whole lot of things involved, because you can get too bogged down. The reason that I spend a fair amount of my time in Yorkshire is because I am fundamentally a city writer, but I need to see the city fresh all the time. I need to go back to Notting Hill Gate and see people there, see characters there, start getting ideas for characters there, and then I might come out here to mulch it over, but I can only write it in the intense environment of the city.
In short, it's not an escape. Coming out here to climb to climb rocks isn't an escape from the city. It's an extension of the urban process into the ex-urban. We see it more and more every day in climbing. You do not go to be a noble poet among the rocks and escape anymore with a pair of big boots. You take a lot of equipment, very complicated equipment. You take a lot of very complicated techniques. You practice in a gymnasium. You chalk your hands. You use it. Millions of lads all over the country are spilling out of the cities and using. They're extending the cities into the ex-urban environment.
I'll start the traverse now.
Yeah,
then.
yeah.
Get some unethical chalk on my fingers.
I started climbing because writing had become too obsessive. It took up 100% of my time. I wasn't sleeping, and I was getting very depressed. So I decided to get fit, and at the same time to take up something exciting, because writing isn't very exciting. Writing might deal with exciting ideas, but it's a very boring business, physically boring.
Although he's still writing, Harrison is moving away from science fiction.
The only reason that I could possibly continue to write science fiction would be to employ a phrase that, as it were, the other side have used very often, which is a sense of wonder. It does allow you to handle enormously powerful images, but it won't allow you to talk about human beings.
Moorcock's latest book, Gloriana, was nominated for the Tolkien Award at this year's World Science Fiction Convention. He had it withdrawn.
The thing is that there's a difference. However well you produce characters, it is still characterization in a science fiction story. If you're going to write about an individual, an absolutely imagined individual, and other individuals with whom that individual reacts, you can use certain elements or certain themes which occur in science fiction novels, but they stop being science fiction novels. You have to make them realistic. You have to give them, as it were, real realities, ordinary social background. Science fiction is fundamentally, as a genre, an infantile form. It's why you have so many adolescents, interchangeable adolescents as central characters. It's why the work of Heinlein, for instance, or Andre Norton or James Blish, you often can't tell the juvenile novels from the adult novels. And that's largely because there isn't any difference. There's no difference in the characters, the way they behave, or anything else. What happened with the writers that you might sort of, the writers that to some extent identify with New Worlds, which is, say, Ballard, Aldous, Dish, Harrison and others, is that they became interested in adults. They were adults. That is to say, they grew up themselves. Therefore, they became more interested in grown-ups. Therefore, they found it impossible to write science fiction as such. You could simply say that they grew out of science fiction.